So let's try and have a look at the evolving cyber threat landscape, and we've seen some excellent speakers today, so let's have a look at this. This is the environment we live in. By the end of 2015, there'll be 7.2 billion people, out of which 4.3 billion people will be in employment, which is 60% of the population, the worldwide population. If we look at that, 1.3 billion people, or 30%, will routinely work remotely. And if we overlay that with some other statistic, 4.9 billion connected things. This is by the end of 2015. So having said that, what are we faced with? An evolving threat landscape, as I've just said. And really, you know, the greatest danger facing us is ourselves, an irrational fear of the unknown, but there's no such thing as the unknown. Only things temporarily hidden, temporarily not understood. So let's try to understand them. The environment is very, very different. Long gone are the days where we just have to protect the perimeter. So we're faced with new approaches. Cyber criminals are very innovative. They change tactics. For those who have been reading the various industry reports, they change tactics, they change methods and tools rapidly to avoid detection. What they also do is they use spam campaigns with hundreds of IP addresses to avoid the IP-based filters. They design malware relying on tools that users trust. We've seen that earlier as well. And most importantly, they are always on the lookout for new vulnerabilities. They don't stop. And of course, first and foremost, they take time to research their targets. And believe me, there is plenty of information out there. For those who are online right now, there's a test I always actually like to do. If you Google, quote, confidential for internal use only, you will be very surprised as to what you found out. I did that a couple of days ago. I actually found a financial product release which was confidential for internal use only, for a product that was due to be launched in October 2015. So,
attackers are becoming more sophisticated. They are shifting vectors quickly, morphing as defenders close or fix vulnerabilities. So in 2014, as Java became more secure, Silverlight attacks spiked 228%. Attackers used more phishing campaigns and became more sophisticated in their approach. Messaging was morphed to evade filters, increasing spam volume by 250%. 2014 saw an increase in malvertising as part of a multi-pronged technique that led users to a persistent state of infection. Affected users jumped 250% in October 2014. Not only are they becoming more sophisticated at morphing attacks, they've become experts in social engineering, making users complicit enablers through click fraud, adware, and outdated browsers. Attackers put all these efforts to work here, where they can exploit gaps between defender intent and action.
So there is a very big disconnect in the industry. And I know we've all heard about patch all the things and lots of advice about that. But looking at this, certainly looking at the Cisco report as well as the Verizon DBI report, in 2014, only 1% of high urgency CVE alerts were actively exploited. So that's a conundrum, because that means organization must prioritize and patch that 1% of all vulnerabilities. So you have to find them and prioritize. 2014 had an all-time high of 24 discovered zero-day vulnerabilities, but even with all the technologies that are around, excellence in process is still what is lacking on the main within organizations and businesses. So there is this ongoing race going on between attackers and defenders, and you got the penalty point.
Although the overall number continues to increase, the types of attacks fall into familiar categories. This year, our research found that 96% of all incidents could be described by just 9 patterns, with 90% attributed to only 4 that all map to human error or misuse. System vulnerabilities followed a similar trend, with the top 10 making up 97% of total compromises. Most of these were known vulnerabilities, where a remedy had been available for more than a year. In fact, some go back as far as 1999, suggesting organizations need to rethink their patching strategies.
I mean, can you believe? You still find the SQL injection as a common vulnerability in systems, which is absolutely unforgivable. So, we have a disconnect. And that disconnect is between the time it takes an attacker to attack and infiltrate and the time it takes for an organization to actually find out and remediate. So we call that the detection deficit. 60% of cases, attackers are able to compromise an organization within minutes. 75% of attacks spread from one victim to the other within 24 hours. That is a very important point. The reason why it's important is because when somebody gets hacked, other organizations should pay attention, not say, oh, poor them, because it could spread to them very rapidly. The top 5 0 days of 2014 were actively exploited by attackers for a combined nearly 10 months. But what's really more scary is that 81% of victims didn't detect the breach themselves. It was either a third party or a customer or law enforcement or regulators. The average time from intrusion to detection is more than 6 months, and I think we've seen that earlier today. Hours instead of days. Now we have minutes instead of hours. Which Star Trek episode was that from? Wrath of Khan, 1982. Great film. Anyway, that means that today, threat intelligence, adaptive security, and incident response have become absolutely essential.
2014 was a year of headline-grabbing security breaches. Still, 90% of organizations reported that they were confident about their security policies, even though more than half reported having been breached.
So we've spoken about the detection deficit. This is called the perception deficit. The perception deficit, which is, I think we're pretty good, to, we may be hacked. So are we prepared for this? As that great philosopher would actually note, insufficient facts always invite danger. So don't rely on perception. I'm going to give you some facts here. In the UK, ID crime represented 48% of all fraud in 2014. 82% of ID-related crime was actually committed online. We live, after all, in a digital world. 23% of recipients open phishing emails and 11% click on attachments. 50% open emails and click on links within the first hour. But first and foremost, if you're so inclined as to devise and operate a phishing campaign of just 10 emails, you can almost slap the guaranteed sticker on it. So, yes, scary again, social engineering and phishing attacks and all those good things are actually extremely valuable. They are valuable because you can actually monetize them. A stolen gaming account is $10 to $15. 1,000 stolen email addresses, 50 cents to $10, depending on what you do with it, and so on and so forth. Why should you care? Well, no doubt some of you would have seen on Monday of this week a UK company, which is still unnamed, so I'm still trying to find out who they are, but that was in the Financial Times and various other publications, handed over £1 million to a fraud caller after being hit with the biggest single phone scam. What actually happened there is that they called and convinced whomever was the recipient of that call that they had their system had been compromised, conned them into handing over credentials. Then they were in the systems and were able to transfer money from various accounts, which amounted to £1 million. Now, the police is, of course, all over it, as well as Action Fraud and all those good people. But the point is, this is not all just about technology, because that could have been stopped. How can you make transfers of £1 million? That's because you haven't got the appropriate governance processes in place. So the technology may have failed, but that could have been caught. So in my opinion, unforgivable. They got what they deserved. So anyway, earlier on this month, for a breach that happened a bit earlier in the year, BitPay lost $1.8 million in a phishing attack. So this is very real. It hits the bottom line very, very clearly. So we operate in a new risk landscape. The digital risk landscape is quite scary. Passwords are still a problem. Everybody is trying to work and trying to find better solutions to the use of passwords and to find the ultimate identity management and authentication system. I believe this to be a tremendous area of growth for the coming years. So we all have multiple online personas within and outside the enterprise, and sometimes we interoperate, especially if we live in a smaller organization. So, and there we are. These are the breaches that happened in 2014. Identities exposed, average of identities exposed, so it's all about identities being exposed. Because after all, why spend time hacking into a system to actually infiltrate an environment illegally and all that pain that you have to go through to do that, where you can actually just steal credentials and access the systems completely legitimately? And of course, we've got the Internet of Things, and bring your own device, and bring your own whatever, bring your own wearable, and so on and so forth, and nobody is actually prepared for that. No. Lots of growth in the IoT and wearables for the enterprise, not quite yet, but better be prepared, because that is definitely coming.
Another first for our report was a study of the risks presented by mobile devices. With the rise of mobility and BYOD, we expected that mobile malware would be a significant threat to organizations. But our analysis proves that it's not. Yet. And while the billions of connected devices, otherwise known as the Internet of Things, made the news a lot last year, attacks against it didn't. Instead, we continue to face familiar foes, like increasingly effective phishing attacks, misuse of credentials, and new varieties of malware that plague organizations of all sizes. Managing risk is critical to the growth, performance, and reputation of your organization. And knowing more about attacks is your most powerful weapon against cybercrime.
So, in God we trust, everybody else brings data. So, Silver lining here from Verizon, you know, it is a threat, it is a problem, but not quite yet. However, we have to be prepared for these things. And the statistics, by all accounts, are quite worrying because only 40% of large companies are not taking proper precaution to secure their mobile applications. And everyone wants a mobile application or a few mobile applications. 33% of companies never test their apps. 5.5%, that is the total security budget for mobile application development out of the mobile application development budget. So quite scary. We are not prepared. And of course, there's the cloud. Now, that's all interesting. I actually like the cloud because the cloud has many benefits, many advantages, be it price flexibility, being able to work from anywhere, access to environments, productivity. For those that are in retail, for example, or other sectors, a desire for omni-channel, interact anywhere, fulfill anywhere. Everybody wants to do that. And therefore, modern behaviors increase the reliance on cloud, managed services, and other kind of third-party solutions. Now, for those who have been watching the news, you will have seen that many of the data breaches over the past 3, 4, even 5 years, Mike, are actually third-party generated. So the supply chain is a very big problem. So managing the supply chain is something that should be key to any cybersecurity strategy. Know your suppliers. How do you manage due diligence? And still, I don't see much maturity in any sectors, really, in terms of supply chain due diligence. In fact, more and more you will find third-party firms, such as law firms, for example, submitting willingly to cybersecurity scrutiny. So what is out there? Well, it's quite different now. It has changed. We've talked about mobile app development, and it's not yet seen in the wild. However, you will have seen that piece of news, which was on Monday, again. Apple removing malicious programs after the first major attack on the App Store. What's actually interesting about that particular attack is that the hackers managed to convince developers of legitimate software to use a tainted version of Xcode. How do you protect against that? And of course, we've got social media. Taryn actually spoke about social media earlier on. This has wider implications. It's got nothing to do with technology. Your LinkedIn profile might be the source of a hacker attack. Lots of phishing attacks on LinkedIn. Some of them very successful. From a regulatory point of view, law firms are heavily regulated, as you do know. And it now becomes a question of ethics over inaccurate LinkedIn endorsements. And of course, somebody lost their job earlier on in the year because they were using Snapchats and making disparaging comments about their company on a public forum. Now, that is stupidity. This one is very scary and very worrying because cybercrime can actually affect economies. We started seeing that in way back. Do you remember the Associated Press Twitter hack? Where they actually said, you know, President Obama, the White House got hit, and the Dow Jones went whoop for 3 hours. I mean, it recovered when they realized the news was actually false, but let's have a look at that. JP Morgan hack. Attackers altered bank records. Regulators are now looking at this because hackers can actually manipulate financial markets, or could. But more recently, and this was in August, so not so far ago, hackers were charged after pocketing $100 million from stolen material. Now, what did they do? They actually appropriated press releases, which were not yet released, to be able to manipulate markets. Now, that is very worrying. And of course, we're all worried, and the pronouncement from America's intelligence chiefs, the next wave of cyber attacks won't steal data, they'll change it. And what's really interesting about that is when we talk about information security, we have the trinity of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, we know what to do with confidentiality, or we should. We know what to do with availability and lots of technology around there. But as far as integrity is concerned, do we actually look at that above and beyond some file integrity monitoring? I don't know. I don't think so. Enterprise assets are no longer within the known perimeter because of what we just said. The perimeter has now completely fractured. And hyperconnectivity is, in itself, bringing a new set of risks. So there are two types of attacks. The opportunistic attacks, such as one NOG would perform, for example, targeting companies with weak security practices and obvious vulnerabilities. There's loads of those. So possible motives, it's just a low-hanging fruit, and they will stumble upon valuable information which they can actually monetize or sell. And there are the more intentional attacks, targeting firms that are highly visible, are involved in highly topical matters, social, environmental, or political issues. So basically, someone who has an axe to grind against an organization, and also celebrity clients. Anyone saw the Kardashian website hack earlier on in the week, 2 weeks ago, I think? Possible motives: further your own political agenda, damage company reputation, access to the information, and also manipulate markets, as we've just seen. So criminals are getting better at knowing you and your business because the information is out there. It's not even very hard to find the information. So anyone knows what that top sort of arrow thing is called? You should.
Kill chain.
Yep, cyber kill chain. So that's the cyber kill chain. And conventional wisdom would say the earlier you stop the kill chain, the less damage, the less cost, and everything else. Absolutely true. So attackers rarely need to use covert methods, as few organizations have effective defenses. As we've just seen, they use common protocols. They can, go unnoticed. And individual controls, as in if you haven't got an all-encompassing cybersecurity strategy where you can have point solutions, you're not going to make much dent into disrupting that particular kill chain. So that means that a new thinking is needed, and I would offer to you, and I'd welcome your feedback, that I've slightly changed the cyber kill chain by modifying the last bit, which was exfiltrate data, by changing it to exfiltrate or manipulate data. That's what the new cyber kill chain should be, in my personal opinion. So the new landscape, what do we need to do? We obviously need new thinking. In the new digital world, we obviously need to make sure that we have adequate supply chain due diligence, that we have adequate identity and authentication management, that we look very carefully at insider threat management. And Tarun earlier on spoke about culture. And that's a very important point, because you can deal with the insider threat on domain exactly in the same way as you would deal with the external threat, with one difference. over and above what you would do for an external malicious actor, it is my belief that for the insider threat, you also need to look at the culture. Because external malicious actors do not operate within social convention. So they have no desire to be socially acceptable. That is very different for an insider within an organization. So culture has definitely got a big role to play in that. So insider threat management, mobile security, of course, because that is unavoidable. API security, because everything is about opening up APIs nowadays, but not much talks about how to secure the APIs. I mean, there are some very good research on that and very good best practice, so I suggest you do look at that as well. Incident response as well, always one of my favorites, has been for many years. Threat intelligence and education and culture. In terms of threat intelligence, there are lots of new technologies around there, so don't be afraid to look at these new players that look at security in a slightly different way. So can we win with all that? Well, I think this is a very good quote. I change the conditions of the test I don't like to lose. So in my opinion, yes, we can. It is a brave new world, but security must be trilateral. It must encompass people, process, and technology. It, of course, must encompass the whole of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You have to study the attackers as they study you. And essentially that means complementing defensive security with offensive security. And I'm not talking about doing anything illegal here. So offensive security in the definition as try to have a strategy that will actually disrupt the cyber skill chain. And don't be afraid to look at new security technology. There are lots of interesting companies out there, and if you want to have a chat with me at the break, I can certainly give you a few names. And of course, you probably were all waiting for that quote during all my presentation, so to boldly go, changing the economics of cyber defense by shifting the cost to the attacker. That's what we're trying to achieve here. And with that, I thank you.
Yeah.